Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome, and so glad you can be with us tonight for this important conversation, Understanding Severe Mental Health Conditions in Children and Youth with Dr. Steve Smith. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, the organization that brings you this program, the Parent Education Series, now in its 17th year. This is a really important topic tonight, and with close to 500 of you registered, we know that it's really hit a nerve, especially on this day, and we're just really glad to have you with us. So again, welcome. We would like to say special thanks tonight, first of all, to Dr. Steve Smith, who's a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, and also to our generous donors from Mills Peninsula Hospital Foundation and San Mateo County Office of Education. We are very grateful for your support to bring us this important series this year. Tonight, Dr. Smith will be speaking to us for about 45 minutes, and then we really want to have time for you, the audience, to ask questions. This is a webinar format most of you are familiar with by now, but there are two ways for you to interact with us. So first of all is the chat button. My co-founder, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links in the chat, so do look for that, but put your questions, if you would, in the Q&A box. So comments, logistics, resources in chat, questions in the Q&A, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can tonight. This program is being video recorded and will be available soon on our video library. With more than 55,000 views, the library has become an important resource for parents and educators. Again, Bev will be putting a link to the video library in the chat. We thank the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula for your help to produce these videos. All right, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's featured presenter. Steve Smith, PhD, is a teaching professor and chair of the Department of Counseling, Clinical, and School Psychology at UC Santa Barbara. He is a director of UCSB's Hosford Counseling and Psychological Services Clinic, and he teaches in the College of Creative Studies at UCSB. Steve is the consulting psychologist to Santa Barbara Middle School, and he also has a private clinical psychology practice in Santa Barbara, where he primarily works with men and boys. Dr. Smith was trained as a clinical child psychologist at the University of Arkansas before completing an internship and fellowship in child and adult psychology at Massachusetts General Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. He served as director of consultation neuropsychology at Mass General before joining the faculty at UCSB in 2004. Dr. Smith is also a lifelong athlete and competitive runner. He lived in the Bay Area from 2014 to 2016, which is where we met, and there he directed the PsyD program at the University of Palo Alto. He's the proud father of two young children who are also athletes in the making. Welcome, Steve Smith. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Charlene. You could just let me know that this is coming through. That would be great.
Looks perfect.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out. As Charlene said, I think this was a really important topic that is striking a nerve for so many of us, particularly today. And I think we've all been horrified to see the news coming out of Texas. And so, really today, although I'm a psychologist, I also join you tonight as a parent who's sitting with all the feelings about how scary and confusing it is to be raising kids right now. Along with COVID, we also have school shootings and other things that weigh on our minds and weigh in the lives of our children. And so some of those things that we're going to talk about here today. So, I think the first thing we need to do is set the scene here a little bit and really remember where it is we are in time. And various outlets have pointed out to us that we're really experiencing a mental health crisis among kids these days. And you've all seen some of these headlines. So this is one from the New York Times. It's life or death, the mental health crisis among U.S. teens. Here's a note from children's hospitals and child health groups are calling on Congress to raise awareness about national mental health and calling for Congress to declare a state of emergency in child mental health. U.S. Surgeon General report came out with a whole, Surgeon General's office came out with a whole report about the pandemic's impact on mental health in children and youth. Another article from New York Times, kids are overwhelming pediatricians, and I'll talk about how we find medication for kids these days, and often we send kids to pediatricians much more often. But everybody is feeling overwhelmed. The American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health, and that came out in 2021. And finally, here's this study that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that the global pandemics of prevalence of depressive and anxiety symptoms in children and adolescents during COVID-19. And what we find, and this paper was published in fall of 2021, and found that rates of depression and anxiety in kids has doubled since the start of the pandemic. So here we are, and this paper was published in 2021, doubled since a year and a half earlier than that. And this article found that 25% of kids meet criteria for depression and 21% meet criteria for some form of anxiety disorder. These rates are really high. They used to only be 4 to 10% for depression and anxiety in teenagers. But the truth is, and one of the things I want to point out to you is that the truth is that they were on an upward trajectory even before the pandemic. And I want to be clear about that. Rates of depression and anxiety and things like drug abuse and even suicide and self-harm were rising even in 2019. The pandemic has accelerated something that was going on with our kids. But the truth is that the seeds of this were being planted even beforehand. So let's try to understand this a little bit. And first, I want to talk about context. This graph is from the US Surgeon General's office, but really it's a distillation of what we call the ecological model. Simply put, we all live, and maybe kids in particular, live in a highly interrelated world with multiple levels of influence. And we see here on this chart, down at the very bottom, the level of the individual. Things like age, genetics, race, disability, coping skills. And if we move further up at the level of the family, you see there in blue, we see family mental health, finances, trauma, all the way up to some of these larger social forces related to racism, government policies, and structural inequalities. And at each level are risk factors and potential protective factors that either increase or decrease a particular child's suffering. And it's important to remember the kids have no power in the system. They are literally at the mercy of the whims of the adults around them, and the policies and the structures that we put in place that influence their lives, they have no power in that. We have no agency in that. And all of us operate in these systems, and they influence all of us. All of these levels are important in determining what sorts of ways the kids will suffer and how they will express their suffering. And given that we're seeing an epidemic of mental health concerns in kids these days, it's clear that the level of problem is not just in individuals or certain families. The more widespread the problem, the larger the ecological forces at play must be. So what I want to do is take a look at some of the more salient factors that lead to the suffering of children. And note that I'm actually trying to not use the word disorder, which implies that there's something wrong with the child. I tend to use the word suffering because I think many of our kids are doing the best that they can within a system that is dysfunctional. There are clearly some children who have some form of serious mental illness or neurodiversity, and I'll talk about those in a while, but I don't think that that represents the majority of cases. So let's take a look at some of our contextual factors. Probably the biggest single predictor of mental health challenges in children is poverty. This number, $26,500, represents the federal poverty line for a family of 4. I want you to take that in for just a second. That's the federal poverty line for a family of 4. This graph shows the percentage of kids in California who are below the poverty line. And the county with the highest percentage of children in poverty is right where I'm standing. It's Santa Barbara County, which may be somewhat surprising. But if you take a look at this chart, all young children, and this chart represents children between the ages of 0 and 5. So all young children, 25% of the kids in California live below this poverty line of $26,500 for a family of 4. And you can look on down the line. Children with non-English proficient parents, that number goes all the way up to 42% of those children live below this line. Latino families, 34%, African American, 27%, and then down to white and Asian, 14% and 13%. And really one of the things that we know is that poverty is a traumatic stressor. The insecurities and anxieties that go along with being poor, the lack of parental attention due to having to work long hours, lack of housing, food security, that's a caustic influence on a developing brain. The basic lack of access to healthcare, nutrition, and consistent education really all lead to suffering. 1 in 5 children below the poverty line have some sort of diagnosable mental health issue. And remember, this is a quarter of the children who live in our state. Another contextual factor in children's mental health is that of trauma. And when we think of trauma, we often think of things like neglect and interpersonal violence, but we also need to consider things like natural disasters, particularly here in California, racism, poverty. The experience of trauma is a huge catalyst for very severe mental health conditions, including psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and, of course, PTSD. Now, the truth is that poverty and trauma have been constants in the lives of children forever. And the pandemic differentially affected poor and marginalized people even more. But I think what's changing is the pressure the kids feel. And it's a pressure that they feel in greater and greater isolation. So the last thing here I want to talk about in terms of context is kind of a garbage pail category that I just call pressure. So let's take a look at some of the things here. The first thing I want to talk about is college. This is an article from the Atlantic Monthly. And my question to you is, when are we going to start to chill out about college admissions? The myth of college scarcity is killing teenagers. Let's say that again. The myth of college scarcity is killing teenagers. Here's a quote from that article. Much of the dysfunction stems from a misperception of how hard getting into college is. At hyper-competitive schools, ridiculously low acceptance rates have become the norm. But selectivity is something of an illusion, stressing students out and leading them to needlessly apply to multiple colleges when they can enroll in only one. The overwhelming majority of colleges admit most students who apply. 75% of schools that use the Common App accept more than half of their applicants. In other words, plenty of spots are out there, just not at the small set of elite institutions whose freshman classes have barely budged in size since the late 1970s. We think that colleges are harder to get into than they were 20 years ago. And for about 150 of the 4,000 universities in this country, that's true. It's harder to get into Stanford and the Ivies and Berkeley and probably here at UCSD too. But most colleges accept most students who apply. And in fact, many colleges are getting fewer applications. Because the other myth that we have is that a selective college will land you a better job and more money. But research actually shows that that's not true. And this is a very classic study from Dale and Kruger, a couple of economists who actually took a look at this over time. And what they found is that there is some benefit to attending a competitive college if you are a member of a racial or ethnic minority or if you are poor. But for most students, the college that they attend doesn't really matter in terms of long-term financial success. What I tell parents is if they can afford an SAT tutor or even know that SAT tutors exist, then statistically speaking, it probably doesn't matter where their kids go to college. What seems to matter most is a feeling of fit and comfort in the college environment. There have been some wonderful podcasts about this. Freakonomics did a whole 3-part series on this. Malcolm Gladwell had a really wonderful podcast about that too. The myth of college scarcity is killing teenagers.
Thank you.
So let's talk about social media. We have lots of studies on social media and kids and the effect of this on their mental health. Time, engagement, and activity on social media all correlate with increases in depression and anxiety in nearly every country where it's been studied. The exceptions are when a kid is in a minority group that doesn't have a sense of community around them. In those cases, social media can be a really helpful place to connect with people who are like them. But for all other kids, social media seems to be a bit of a negative on the whole. Way back in 1967, psychologist by the name of David Elkind coined the term imaginary audience. It's a tendency for kids and teenagers to believe that their behaviors and their actions are the main focus of other people's attention. That sense that teenagers have that people are really always watching them and paying attention to them. But here we have a situation where kids are working to cultivate an online persona. What you see in the literature is being a curated self, to be more acceptable to an audience. And it creates this disconnect between an online self and a real self. And when your real self feels sad and lonely, and everybody else's online self is having a great time, this is a catalyst for some distress. And this also amplifies what we see as an ongoing trend toward an outcome orientation. Kids want to have the biggest house, the best friends, the best clothes, and the most money. Research is showing us that kids are so much more fixated on being wealthy these days and having a lifestyle that they can show off. This is beginning to usurp values related to making a positive influence in the world or even having a sense of community. And the other thing that we see are teenagers are increasingly talking about how depressed they are on social media. And to some extent, I think that's good because it reduces stigma, but it can also glamorize suffering in a way that I think it's not so healthy. And then kids also get exposed to dangerous extremism that seems to be fueling more and more expressions of hatred. Climate anxiety. I don't even think we know enough about this yet. But research, we have increasingly good data that shows that kids feel hopeless about the future of the planet and resentful for inheriting a world that's ignoring climate change. And I hear this in my office from kids all the time, and they'll say things like, well, none of this really matters because the earth is burning up anyway. And often they'll say it in this kind of offhand sort of way. But my sense is that they really feel that on some level. And so once we begin to add to these things, all the other things kids have been dealing with for a while, threats of school shootings like we've seen today, increased attention to racism, racial violence like we saw in Buffalo just recently, violent video games, a shrinking job market, political polarization, and disconnection that comes from living in an electronically connected world. They are, simply put, just bombarded with a lot of negative information. And families, all of us, we're just stretched so thin. It's a lot for all of us to deal with. And all these things are additive. They're more relevant for some kids, they're less relevant for others. And all of our kids have had a year of lockdown, restrictions and masks, Zoom school, and a disconnection from friends. But as we're grappling with unprecedented suffering in kids these days, We need to attend to all of the contextual factors that are impacting all of them and all of us, quite frankly. So let me zoom back out. And here I want to talk about some specific issues. I want to talk about some particular presentations of mental health concerns that we might see in kids. And I want to start with this quote. Psychopathology is a person's best attempt to solve a problem. This quote is so old, I can't even figure out who said it anymore, but it was something that I learned in graduate school, and it stuck with me this whole time. That when we think about what we mean when we talk about disorders or mental health problems in kids, we need to think about what that really means when we say that. For most disorders, I think about them as a clash between a person's capacity to cope, their style of coping, and the demands of their environment. That is, we all have coping resources and ways of solving the problem of living. But if we have inadequate resources or our coping systems don't work with the stresses that we face, we start to break down. We start to withdraw from the world. That's depression. Or do we try to be in the future to control it? And that's anxiety. As adults, we often have systems of coping that worked for us as kids, but they no longer work in an adult context. Everybody's trying to solve the problem of living. Trying to manage our relationships, our connections with other people, to get our work or schoolwork done. Those are challenging things. Those are the problems of living. And I think what's happening with our children is that the problems of living are just getting bigger. And they're still children. Their coping systems just can't handle the world that we've put them in. Another basic concept here is one known as diathesis stress. And this is an old idea that basically says we all have some vulnerabilities and we all have some strengths. That's the diathesis part. What is our personal palette of genetic predispositions, trauma, family modeling, social support, physical attributes, and demographic variables like race and culture and gender expression? These form our unique portfolio of risk and protective factors. But then we're put under some kind of stress. Maybe it's a sudden trauma. Maybe it's something more chronic like poverty, global pandemic, bullying, or pressure from parents or peers that they need to get into a good college. Or maybe it's just a combination of puberty, TikTok videos, social pressure, constant news about war, shootings, and viruses. It's the combination of diathesis and stress that gives rise to a kid's particular expression of their suffering. Another complication of kids' mental health is that many issues present exactly the same way. Kids have the same capacity for suffering as adults do, but they lack the language to express themselves in the same way that an adult might. So what you see in kids are more behavior problems, arguing, irritability, withdrawal, self-injury, aggression, changes in sleep patterns, appetite, or peer relationships. And these issues might be reflective of something like a depression, or they might be stemming from anxiety, family problems, trauma, or even something like bipolar disorder. It's really difficult to tease out what's going on unless you spend a lot of time with a kid. So let's take a closer look at some of the things that we're seeing. The first category of mental health concerns, I just put in a category called expressions of distress. And here, I put things like the two primary things that we express distress or suffering, and this is true for adults as well as it is for children, or anxiety and depression. And again, think of depression as being a withdrawal from the world because it's painful, and anxiety is running ahead in time in order to try to predict and control the things that are going to happen. So the two primary ways that we express distress or suffering, and the things that I'm seeing the most, are anxiety and depression. PTSD, I have, post-traumatic stress disorder, I have on here as a way of expressing distress over a very severe form of stress. But all three of these are ways of coping with a world that feels overwhelming, painful, dangerous, or insecure. And given all that we've been through recently, it makes sense that we're seeing an uptick in expressions of distress. When I work with kids and the kids who come to my office, it feels as though the line between depression and anxiety is kind of a dotted one. And they tend to vacillate back and forth between expressing their distress through anxiety or depression. For kids under a lot of pressure, that sort of driven kid who's trying to make like a 5.0 GPA, often I feel like their anxiety comes first. But then that depression will begin to settle in when they realize that they have a little power to change things or to see a bright or a different future for themselves. These things present similarly. You'll look for changes in appetite, sleep, changes in sleep, either more or less, withdrawal, moodiness. Littler kids, you tend to get more tantrums, more irritability, self-harm, so things like cutting and burning. Sometimes you'll see the picking of the fingernails. Some children will pull out their hair. You also see increases in risk-taking, where kids just kind of don't care anymore, or they're driving too fast, those sorts of things. Aggression, lack of energy, and dropping grades. And a lot of times with those kids who are really, really driven, the grades will be the last thing to change because they're working so hard to maintain their GPAs. It's not uncommon for there to be some kind of suicidal ideation as well. With something like PTSD, I actually don't tend to think of PTSD as being a disorder, but rather a form of coping with an extremely dangerous environment, or an environment that feels dangerous. Soldiers in combat don't have PTSD until they get home, because symptoms of PTSD are adaptive in dangerous places. Kids who are raised in poverty or insecure or dangerous or conflictual places or homes often have symptoms of PTSD that are then mislabeled as conduct disorders or ADHD, and then they're much more likely to end up in the justice system. And context always matters in terms of how we make sense of a kid's behavior. So those are what I think of as being the primary expressions of a kid's distress. And certainly from all the research that's coming out, these are the things that are increasing in prevalence in kids these days, primarily. The second category here I've labeled as problems with affect or behavioral regulation. So these are regulation problems. And here I've lumped together bipolar disorder and ADHD, which may seem like an odd pairing to some of you. But really, they're both conditions where a child lacks an ability to regulate themselves in one way or another. So bipolar is an inability or some difficulty regulating emotion, whereas ADHD is difficulty regulating behavior or attention. And so bipolar is largely thought of as being heavily genetically determined. If you have it in your family, your child is at increased risk, statistically speaking. Bipolar in children is actually pretty controversial. But what you see in the literature is a kid who often rapidly escalates in often irritable or maybe even silly behavior, sometimes dangerous and risky behavior, but then quickly drops down to baseline or even into a depressive state. You hear of children who can stay awake for days at a time and not feel tired, and then have a mood crash that then impacts the quality of their functioning. It's rare, but it happens. Often these kids are labeled initially as having ADHD or depression or even conduct problems. Personally, in my practice, I'm very hesitant to label any child as having a bipolar disorder largely because a regulation of affect is sort of a developmental thing. And if a kid might be behind in terms of their ability to regulate themselves, it doesn't mean that they have a serious psychiatric issue. So I tend to be a little skeptical of a bipolar disorder, bipolar diagnosis prior to college age. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but I think it's something that should be diagnosed very cautiously. Rates of ADHD are on the rise. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I'll talk about that in a second. My personal feeling is that the disorder itself is somewhat problematic because the symptoms are actually pretty unspecific. It's true that there are a lot of cases of real ADHD where a child just really struggles with paying attention, with sitting still, with organizing themselves, keeping track of pencils and papers and all that sort of stuff. Those things are real. But there are a lot of reasons that a kid can have trouble paying attention, anxiety being the most prominent of these. As one of my supervisors once said to me, if you grow up in a house where your parents are hitting each other or yelling at each other all the time, it makes it pretty difficult to pay attention to your math homework. Other things that can give rise to attention problems are lack of sleep, poor nutritional habits, learning disabilities, and depression. In my opinion, the best diagnosis of ADHD comes after a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation to actually test a kid's attention rather than just relying on a behavioral checklist. My sense is that we'll continue to see rates of ADHD rise. There are more things that compete for our attention. And the brain wires itself to meet the demands of its environment. And with video games and other fast-paced visual stimuli that bombard kids' brains, it might be that we're raising a generation of kids who will struggle with some attention difficulties given the environment that they grow up in. Let's talk about thought disorders. And this is really the most serious and probably the most rare of the conditions. We have psychotic disorders here, such as schizophrenia. Bipolar actually fits here too, because many people with bipolar can have psychotic features. There are a few conditions that mainly present through some type of paranoid process. And I think the consensus is that most of these conditions here have a strong genetic loading. They tend to run in families, and they generally don't present themselves to the late teens or early 20s. You do see some childhood schizophrenia diagnoses. These are sometimes related to things like maternal malnutrition or birth complications, some virus exposure in utero. Rates of trauma in children and adults with schizophrenia are also higher than in the general population. So if you remember the diathesis stress piece, there's a lot of stress in the backgrounds of folks with schizophrenia. It's really hard to draw conclusions about causes here. Symptoms of thought disorder include hallucinations and delusions, withdrawal, lack of eye contact, flat emotional expression, so not a whole lot of emotional expression, isolation, poor attention. Thought disorder diagnoses in kids are exceedingly rare. The symptoms of childhood and schizophrenia are often diagnosed as ADHD or autism, anxiety disorders. When these cases come up, when they come up for us here in our clinic or in my practice, the first place that I will refer them is to a neurologist to rule out other medical issues or tumors or drug toxicity and that sort of stuff. So let's talk about neurodiverse conditions. And here we have things like autism spectrum disorders and learning disorders or learning differences. And we tend to think of these things as mostly or even entirely biologically driven, or at most they have something to do with prenatal development. And the neurodiversity movement has been really helpful as recasting these sorts of conditions as neurodevelopmental differences rather than disorders or disabilities. And that's particularly true for autism. And you hear more and more people talking about being autistic without the same shame and stigma that you might have encountered a decade ago. But despite the acceptance of the condition, social challenges faced by these kids are real, particularly during junior high years when conformity is really at a premium. Learning disorders often reveal themselves through behavioral challenges. That is, a kid with an undiagnosed dyslexia will often act out in school because they're frustrated or ashamed. They feel dumb in comparison to other kids in their class. If a child hates school because it's differentially challenging for them, it's easy for us to understand why they might express their frustration through acting out in some way. Acting out by students with learning disabilities, particularly students of color, is well known in the literature, and there's often literature. There's literature out there that talks about the school to prison pipeline for kids with learning disabilities who are in learning disorders and challenges who are so disgruntled by the school environment. And finally, one of the things I want to talk about in terms of a specific mental health challenge are the addictions that we're seeing. One of the biggest issues we're seeing in kids today are addictions to substances and screens. During the pandemic, for example, I met with a bright and talented, and very charming 18-year-old high school senior. During the pandemic, he was forced to sit at home all day in an empty house and attend Zoom school. And each morning he would drive to the liquor store and buy 2 bottles of wine that he would consume by himself all day long, getting increasingly drunk. He maintained a high GPA, he was a varsity athlete, and he got into one of the most competitive colleges in the country. But when he told me how lonely and boring his days were, I could understand his desire to check out. We also know that teenagers are using plenty of marijuana, which is pretty terrible for their brains, and vaping nicotine, which seems just completely insane to me. There's also a sense these days among kids that cocaine is no big deal, and the abuse of prescription medications like benzodiazepines and Adderall continues to get worse. And we've all heard the horror stories of drugs that are laced with fentanyl and all of the deaths that have followed from that. But I think that video games and pornography also fall into a category of potentially addicting activities. Video games are complicated for a lot of kids, and I'm sure for many of your children, because they also form the basis of a child's social activities, particularly during the course of the pandemic. But research is clear that playing violent video games seems to be a negative on the whole for young brains. And these are activities that also remove a kid from engagement from their real life peers, family activities, or opportunities to learn. And often, I think that they differentially affect boys and young men. It's been said that the combination of pornography, video games, and marijuana is wiping out a whole swath of boys and college-age men. But we can understand how a kid might look to these activities as means of self-medication and self-soothing. The kid that I saw drank because he was bored. He was disconnected from friends and sports and lonely and isolated and despondent over the condition of the world. And I don't blame him for wanting to check out. So what do we do? Well, if we all believe the ecological model, what we do has to incorporate all of these levels. And we need to understand that we're all related in one larger system. Even if your children are not directly impacted by trauma or poverty or racism or other negative social impacts, they're influenced by it indirectly. We're all in this together. For all of us and for our children, we need to remember the basics. Make sure your child is getting enough sleep and eating well. Remember, or make sure that there's a diversity of experiences in their day-to-day life. Exercise is important for all of us, and it's a wonderful way to connect. Make sure that they have time and space to connect with friends and family. Make sure that there's time for them to play. Screens and social media don't seem to be going anywhere. So make sure that they're informed consumers of it and understand that a lot of it is sort of trickery to get their money. If you have a child who seems to be suffering, get help. and encourage your children to raise concerns about their peers if they are concerned about them. I got a couple of weeks ago, I got a wonderful email from a 14-year-old girl who's concerned about her friends and wanted my advice on how to get help for her. It was a wonderful moment. Now, getting help these days is often easier said than done because most mental health professionals are booked and overwhelmed, including myself. Neuropsychological assessment can be a really good way to assess for relative degrees of suffering or learning issues or attention problems. Therapists these days are sometimes easy enough to come by. Qualified therapists are harder to find, and psychiatrists available to manage medications are somewhat like unicorns. I'm increasingly just telling parents to take their children to their pediatrician to start medication for depression and anxiety. Research on the pandemic has shown that kids who use positive coping skills, like spending time with their friends, reading, finding humor, engaging in spiritual activities, and helping others, having open conversations with their parents, those kids who use those kind of coping mechanisms had better outcomes than those kids who felt more isolated. Social support and positive family connections are so critical to children's mental health. When a child is suffering, families need to take a look inward too. A systemic model of pathology suggests that kids express the problems that exist in the family unit. Parents, if you are struggling with your mental health issues or your addictions, get treatment. Sometimes the best treatment for a child's issues is marriage therapy for the parents. Reduce your phone time and your social media engagement. Encourage balance in your lives and that of your children. Promote education rather than meaningless prestige when thinking of colleges or careers. Reduce pressure in your kid's life. Connect with other families so that you and your children have a sense of community. Humans evolved to live communally with multiple generations and extended family around. And we have lost so much by being so isolated. Your parenting and your children will benefit from a sense of being part of a community. Remember that the world that our children navigate is far more complicated than the ones that we were raised in. A valid criticism of my field of psychology is that we seek individual or family cures for social problems. That is, we focus all of our attention on helping individuals and families rather than addressing the larger social problems that really cause an undue influence. Then that sends a message to the kids that they're broken, when the truth is that they're probably fine, but dealing with life in a system that is caustic and hard to navigate. So at the level of our communities, we need to have safe places for kids to go, to congregate, to goof around. We need affordable nutrition, healthcare, and mental health care for people who have neither the means nor insurance. If you have the capacity to write big checks, please consider making donations to community mental health centers or even university-based clinics like the one that I run, because we're really in the trenches with the most vulnerable of people. At the level of society, we need to address issues like systemic racism, climate change, healthcare initiatives, poverty, and political divisiveness. These things affect all of our lives, but are differentially challenging for kids to navigate. And we clearly need stricter gun laws. One of the lessons of COVID is that we are all interconnected. Kids are suffering because some things need fixing in our world. We all share responsibility for helping out, for reducing the burdens that children and families carry, and using technology to help educate and connect rather than isolate and fuel negative social comparison. We all have a role to play, and our kids need us like they never have before. Thank you so much for making the time to attend tonight, and I am done. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Steve Smith, for a really brilliant discussion. of suffering in children and youth. I think that you've really laid it out so clearly and given us some challenges that are fair. Look at that. Lots of great responses from people. Thank you, Steve. It was really brilliant. Some great questions coming in too. So let's have at it. You know, somebody just wrote into the chat, it kind of broke my heart. They said, do you have resources for safe places for kids to go hang out? And I thought, we used to. We had bowling alleys and mini golf courses and parks, and a lot of them are just being plowed under. Do you have any ideas? I mean, that to me, if I could write big checks, that's what I would do, is develop more places for kids to just goof around, like you said.
Yeah, no, it's a real consideration. You know, when I was a kid, it was the shopping mall, and increasingly shopping malls don't exist anymore, or places where there's retail going on. And those places, we've all moved all that stuff online, and so those places are kind of ghost towns now. I think sports fields serve a little bit of that function, but no, I think our communities are ill-equipped to really give kids good, safe places where they can kind of go and be obnoxious and hang out the way that they're kind of supposed to. I really don't have a good answer to that, and maybe others of you do, and you could share those things in the chat so that other people can generate some ideas, because I do think it's a really big loss for us.
That's great. Folks are mentioning teen sections at library, after school programs. Those are all good ideas. People, if you've got other ideas, throw them in the chat. We love it. Steve, let's dive in. These are really good questions.
Great.
Here's one from Jackie. Do you think we're paying enough attention to the emotional regulation aspect of ADHD versus the academic assistance that gets the focus?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think, one of the things that has always frustrated me about child psychology, and maybe I shouldn't speak in so broad terms, but one of the things that often frustrates me is we often just really pay attention to children's behavior. And how is this child behaving? How are they acting? Are they following the rules? Are they standing in line? And really not attending to their emotional experience. If they have problems or challenges, like, what is it like for them to have that challenge? How frustrating and scary and all of that. And so when children have ADHD, I think there's so much attention on, like, how do we get them to sit still and pay attention and keep track of their pencils or what have you, and really not attending to the fact that there's an emotional component that goes along with that too. There's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of embarrassment, and then the emotional fluctuations that go along with that too. And so there I think it's incumbent upon people in my field to pay attention to that. But really, if you're a parent with a child with ADHD and things like autism as well, where there's just a lot of focus on getting them to act correctly, I think part of the role of the parent really is to be the spokesperson for that child's emotional world too.
Good point. Thank you, Steve. So here again is the $1 million question. You touched on this. Parent says, I have a 12-year-old who's very addicted to her iPad. Different video games seems to lead to mood swings, bad behavior, sleep patterns being disrupted. Do you have any suggestions for how to make her stay away from this digital device?
Yeah, so volumes, books, websites, there's so much information about that. And I think everybody is feeling that same pressure of not knowing how to regulate, because part of the thing with the iPad and the phones is that's their social connection too. What we see in kids is that the differentiation between online friends and real life friends is not a distinction that's real for them. And so I think there has to be limits. There just has to be limits. We set limits on everything else that children do. I think there has to be limits on that. And those limits are really, they have to be individualized for the child. So I can't just say, well, for your kid, it needs to be this. But, anecdotally, at least in my clinical practice, I would sit with this 15-year-old girl, and her parents took away her phone and gave her a flip phone. And she freaked out at them and was so mad. But then in my office, she was like, it's such a relief. It's such a relief. It's such a relief. And so I think that sometimes the leading edge of that is they don't want to give it up, but sometimes after they do, they will feel that sense of relief. And if they have to be mad at you a little bit, I think that's okay in the long run. That part I think you can sort out. They're not going anywhere. And so part of the other thing is really being thoughtful and educational with kids about what is this online thing? What are the dangers of it? What's really happening? What's the profit motive of TikTok? What are they in it for? And so understanding and being really thoughtful consumers of these things, and kids are smart and kids are way more savvy online than I think we give them credit for. But I think it all has to be contextualized and they have to understand what these things are. But you know what, when a kid really does feel addicted to something and it feels like an addiction, we wouldn't let them keep smoking. And so I think we have to think of it like that.
I think also, Steve, would you agree that somebody like Ross Green's work on collaborative and proactive solutions, bring your kid into the solution box?
Yeah, great. Thanks for saying that. And sometimes when I work with kids and their parents, and there's a lot of disagreement over that, I say, come in, let's all talk about it. And the thing I always say when I work with parents and kids is, if everybody leaves here dissatisfied, I've done my job. And so the parents have given too much, the kids have given too much, and they find a spot in the middle, and that's what compromise is. And often kids are really thoughtful about that too. And some of them will say, yeah, you know what, I know that I do it too much, but I can't stop. And they will be happy to have your help.
Okay, good point. Thank you, Steve. I think this is a really good question. Parent says, I have a teen who's moderately depressed. Her therapist mentioned that she struggles with negative thinking. How can parents help in this area, especially when the teen is not willing to share her thoughts?
Well, first, great, glad you got a therapist. And yeah, stinking thinking, we call that. So, one of the things that I think can be really helpful for parents to do is just sort of model their own thought processes and their emotional experiences. Like, wow, I had this really hard day, and here's the things that I thought, but these are the other things that I did. And because some, kids don't talk about things all so much. So a lot of times you do it indirectly, either by modeling it, and they may not want to hear that. But I think if you model it, you open up, you talk about your own struggles, you talk about your own thoughts. You don't need to go into details with things or into the darkest recesses of your own mind. But I think having some real conversations about, that thoughts are thoughts, they can't hurt us, feelings are feelings, and they can't hurt us. And these things are actually relatively transient, and we can sort of attend to them or not attend to them. And, and I think if you have an open enough dialogue where negative thoughts have been identified, then it really is about how do you cope with that? Like, okay, well, you're having those thoughts, what do you do? And so, but I think, if you've got a therapist, I think some of that can just stay in the therapist's office so the kid doesn't feel like they're coming home to more therapy. And then, of course, the fastball, I think, for having really good conversations with your kids is just get them in the car and drive somewhere. And after a while, they'll start telling you all sorts of stuff.
That's true. It works at any age, really.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Steve. Kid asks, do you have any advice for family finding treatment for childhood schizophrenia, especially when the wait lists are so long? What can families do while they're waiting those months to get an appointment?
Wow, that's a really hard question. I think and again, I don't, everything is specific to a particular child. But one of the things that's really helpful with people with schizophrenia of all ages is just some degree of predictability, and routines are really helpful. Structure is really helpful. Keeping the volume low on emotion. So if there's conflict in the family or things are loud and unsafe, anything that you can do to really reduce pressure and increase the predictability and a sense of safety, those are the things that help folks with schizophrenia feel like the most contained. And in the short run, boy, it is a real challenge. And like many of the things that we're talking about today, I don't have great solutions for those. The wait list, the long time, the lag time. Yeah, we're in it together, and I'm really sorry that we're all struggling.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So back to parents and communication for a minute, another very hot topic. Do you have any suggestions for kind of conversation openers to get a teen to talk with parents? If you could solve that one, that would be.
I know. How are you? It depends upon the kid, and there are times when your child may be more quiet, and there are times when your child is going to be more chatty. And by times I don't mean time of day, but just like periods in their life. I think some of that has to start pretty early, and like letting children know that it's good and safe to talk with you. So, and I think that's a conversation you can have with teenagers too. Like, look, if you have something going on, you can always tell me, and I'm not going to get mad, and you're not going to be punished. I just really want to hear what's going on, because it's important to me that you are safe, and that it's my job to take good care of you and to help you navigate this period of your life. And I think you can just float those little balloons every now and again. And one of the things to take home, and research has shown this for as long as we've been doing research on teenagers, is that you always, as a parent, you always have an influence, in that even if they're not listening to you, they're listening to you. And even though you may feel that all of a sudden this alien has come into your life and they are a brick wall of non-responsiveness, they listen to you and they care about what you think. And so you can keep talking, you keep inviting them to conversations, take them for a ride in the car, get them out of their natural environment, and just keep opening and opening and opening. And you might have a teenager who shuts down for a while, but if you keep planting those seeds, eventually they will come back. But I think the important thing for all parents to remember, particularly parents of teenagers, is even if it feels like they have tuned you out, they haven't.
That's a really good point, Steve. And those little tiny bursts, like you said, a bunch of these 6-second interactions, it's my job to care about you, I really want to hear how you're doing, is better than sitting a kid down and saying we need to talk, right?
It is. It is. And the other thing that I would also say is, if you have a teenager, tread lightly. You also don't need to get in the weeds of their social problems. And that, I think, drives them completely nuts. And if you want something that will shut your kid down, like ask them about, like, what Amber said about Jessica today in class. Like, you don't need that level of detail. That's not your job. But, if they come to you with that, that's different. But sort of getting into the weeds of their lives, I think, is a way for them to start to push you away a little bit. All
right. Well, listen, we have so many wonderful questions. I want to thank all of you for the wonderful questions, but I do want to honor Dr. Smith's time and the time of our attendees tonight. Steve, in the minute that we have left together, what would you like to finish with tonight for parents? And again, thank you for all the hearts, everybody, and really nice.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Again, I'm hopeful. Like, I continue to be hopeful, even though we've talked about a lot of really negative things. I think there's just a lot of reason to be very hopeful. And I think that even though our children are going through a tough time right now, and we're all going through a tough time, my wish is that we're all going to emerge from this much more resilient, much more connected, much more understanding of one another, in the fact that we're really in all of this together. So my hearts go out to you. It's hard, scary, and stressful to be a parent right now, but keep up with the good work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steve Smith. That was a brilliant ending. Thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you everyone for joining us for this wonderful conversation about mental health conditions in children and youth. Take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.